Dead Space is a game that I've briefly praised on this channel before, as part of a wave of innovative and experimental titles that were released at the start of the HD era in the mid-2000s. While it clearly used Resident Evil 4 as its action horror template, Dead Space had an original setting, a parade of explosive set pieces, and a unique dismemberment mechanic that lent some strategy to the combat, on top of the genre staples of inventory and resource management. Simply put, Dead Space had enough twists of its own to make it a fresh and memorable experience that many players still look back on fondly today, myself included. That nostalgic goodwill, and the fact that no other major game has really tried to capitalize on it in the last 15 years, meant that the Callisto Protocol, a game billed as a spiritual successor with many of the same creators working on it, should have been looking at a slam dunk. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. I'm going to be quite critical of the Callisto Protocol in this video, but please believe me when I say that I take no pleasure in tearing this game apart. As a fan of Dead Space, I was really looking forward to it. It wasn't Elden Ring take a week off work levels of hype, but still I was eager enough to check it out that I bought it close to release. Now, I wish I hadn't paid full price for it. So what the hell went wrong? A lot has changed in the 15 years since Dead Space came out, and to its credit, Callisto makes an attempt at bringing something new to the table with its close-range combat mechanics. Sadly, this is also the most divisive part of the game, and while I can see some potential in it, I didn't exactly come away impressed. In almost every department besides the combat, Callisto is stuck playing catch-up to a game that released half my lifetime ago. Whether it's the lack of enemy variety, the sameness and low draw distance of the environments, the identical boss fight that gets reused over and over, or the insane placement of checkpoints that force you to waste time doing the same inventory management every single time you die and respawn, everything about Callisto just feels cheap. Everything, that is, apart from the casting of Hollywood actors in the main roles, and I have my doubts as to whether the developers had their priorities straight when allocating their budget. You have to question the wisdom of paying a famous face to appear in your game, when 99% of the playthrough will be spent looking at the back of their head, or the inside of it. While I'm here, I should address the game's gore because I can't put a message on the screen every time a head pops open. Consider yourself warned that this is an extremely bloody game and not for the squeamish. The gruesome death sequences are the only thing harder to stomach than the game's price. I watched a Wired interview with Callisto's director Glenn Schofield before release, and I couldn't help but notice the glee with which he boasts about the game's boundary-pushing butchery. Its Wikipedia page notes that it was denied release in Japan because of the levels of violence, and I have no doubt that Glenn wears this as a mark of pride. In fact, the Steam page for the game's Season Pass specifically boasts that it adds 13 new death animations to the experience. It says this above the sentence about actual story DLC, by the way. For all the effort that was put into these animations, I found myself getting desensitized to them very quickly, and while it's possible that this says more about me than it does about Callisto, I think the uncanny valley that the game resides in isn't doing it any favors. The hyper-realistic faces plastered over the top of gamey and artificial environments meant that I was usually more bewildered than immersed, and the number of times I felt afraid while playing this game can be counted on one hand. This is all to say nothing of the game's awful technical performance on PC, which led to a slew of negative reviews on Steam before the devs could get a day one patch out. I played it 2 weeks after release and still had to tweak the graphical settings before I could get a reliable frame rate. Even after all that, it was rare that 2 hours of my playthrough went by without running into another weird glitch or glaring oversight, like this one where the first letter of each line is missing from certain signs. In all my years, I've never seen a graphical slip-up like this one, and I truly have no idea how this could have happened. Errors like this only serve to rip you out of the experience, and they're yet another factor that contributes to Callisto feeling cheap, all but guaranteeing that you won't be getting immersed in this world. Whether or not the months of developer crunch that pushed the game out the door had a part to play in this, I couldn't possibly say, but there's no question in my mind that Callisto came out half done. The fact that the story's real ending has been put behind a DLC purchase is all the proof you need of that, and it's an unbelievably scummy move that shredded my last bit of goodwill for Callisto. I probably won't bother playing that DLC unless it fixes a lot of problems I have with the game, which it almost certainly won't. With all that said, here's your spoiler warning before I proceed to get into the finer details of the Callisto Protocol, although after this damning introduction you're probably no longer on the fence about playing it. I'm sorry to say that I can't recommend this game, but if you want to find out exactly why, or if you were similarly disappointed by it and want to listen to a guy on the internet tell you what you already know, then let's get into it. Okay, so the premise is that it's 300 years in the future, and you play as this guy, Jacob Lee, a cargo pilot carrying out a contract from the United Jupiter Company to ferry medical supplies between the Jovian moons. When his ship is boarded by a terrorist group, it ends up crashing on Callisto, an inhospitable moon whose only notable feature is the notorious Black Iron Prison. I don't think it's ever explained what this supposed terrorist group actually wants or even does for that matter, but that's just one of those things you need to let go in this game's plot. Jacob's co-pilot is killed in the crash, and both Jacob and the terrorist leader Danny are taken to the prison as inmates. Luckily for Jacob, he soon wakes up to the shit hitting the fan, and even though it says lockdown on the wall right there, his cell door opens and your journey through Black Iron Prison begins. Right off the bat, I have some thoughts here. I mentioned it already in the intro, but it bears repeating that the Callisto Protocol suffers from a serious case of Uncanny Valley, not just in terms of the character designs, but in the environments too. Clearly a lot of effort was put into the lighting, the facial and motion capture, and the various graphical effects that bring your frame rate to a shuddering crawl, but I really think the devs missed the forest for the trees by focusing so intently on this part of the presentation. An uncomfortable number of environments seem to be just floating in the ether, shrouded in this convenient fog, and it was rare that I felt any real sense of place during my playthrough. Way too much time is spent walking, crawling, or shimmying through generic maintenance tunnels for the game's own good. Sorry, maintenance tunnels. The game didn't need more polygons and particle effects, and it certainly didn't need fucking ray tracing. What it needed was some stronger art direction. To give credit where it's due, there was one location in the game that stood out to me as a highlight of environmental design, and that was the shantytown that makes up the original Callisto colony of Arcus, hidden underground beneath the prison and visited in the second half of the game. This was the United Jupiter Company's first attempt at attracting colonists to Callisto, and yet it's been hastily cobbled together with improvised scrap metal, which tells a story about the desperation or the deception that went into convincing people to move here. The different floors and buildings are named and indicated by homemade signs, and I particularly enjoyed finding the bar and grill, where I could picture the old colonists sitting and unwinding. Thankfully, these signs have all the right letters on them. There is potential in the setting of Callisto, but this tiny sliver of environmental storytelling is pretty much all you get throughout a playthrough. There's sadly not much to distinguish the other areas. Another factor that makes most environments in the game feel artificial is their uncompromising linearity. There's a perfect example of this the instant Jacob leaves his cell, where this pitiful pile of debris immediately blocks your passage left and forces you to the right. This is undoubtedly an effective way of herding the player in the direction you want them to go, but it also trains the player to look at the game's environments through a designer's eyes and see them as artificial spaces. You're not thinking, where do I want to go next? You're thinking, where am I supposed to go? Or worse, where am I allowed to go? I realize, of course, that you could level the same complaint at almost any modern linear game, but because Callisto strives so hard for graphical realism, even small things like this can shatter the illusion of reality and prevent you from getting immersed in the experience. And when you run into a graphical glitch or something that just doesn't make sense, then your sense of immersion flies out the window faster than this guy. This is why I feel so strongly that the game is stuck in the Uncanny Valley, and it's just one of the many ways the devs shot themselves in the foot by focusing on visuals above all else. Here's another one. Callisto is absolutely overflowing with narrow passages that you have to squeeze or shimmy through. It feels like you can't go 15 minutes without running into another one. There are so many of these, and they completely obliterate the game's pacing. There's an animation for climbing into event, an animation for turning a corner in event, an animation for turning around in event, and an animation for getting out of event, and the extent of your interaction with all of it is just holding forward on the controller, sometimes for way, way too long. If these crawl spaces were included out of necessity to hide loading, then this is the only evidence you need that the devs aimed way too high in terms of graphics. If they're genuinely here as an artistic choice, then whoever made that call should be in jail because this is insufferably boring. Many of them feature these tepid jump scares, but because you know you're not in any danger, they're just not scary at all, and are more likely to make you roll your eyes than bite your nails. Anyway, let's get back to the first few minutes of the game so that we can talk about the combat. Following along the only path you can follow, you pass by Elias, who gives you his shiv and asks you to get his cell door open by using the controls in the guard tower. So yeah, still no idea why Jacob's cell opened by itself. It's inside that guard tower that the game's melee combat system is introduced, and your first exposure to it will likely be one of utter confusion. The QTE-like tutorial doesn't do a great job at explaining how it works, and when you're let loose on your first enemy immediately afterwards, you'll still be figuring it out. Your experience may have been different, but I left this room completely perplexed about what had just happened, and my hopes for the combat system sank like a stone. I warmed up to it a bit as the game progressed, but that feeling of, wait, what? Never fully went away. My problem with the melee combat is that it feels so static and rigid. You have to wait for the enemy to swipe at you, which is automatically dodged just by holding the movement stick left or right with no timing required, and then maybe dodge a second swipe in the other direction if the enemy is feeling spicy, and then whack them a few times yourself. Because most enemies are damage sponges, you may have to rinse and repeat this whole process 2 or 3 times to take one down, which just feels incredibly tedious. What's worse is that this very basic pattern is exactly the same for almost every enemy in the game, whether it's the mutated man or the fat mutated man. When an enemy gets in close to you, it's practically impossible to get away from them, not only because they're fast enough to keep pace with you, but because the game's automatic dodge mechanics will often cause you to dodge when you don't really want to. Dodging in Callisto works differently to almost every other game in existence, because dodging is an action that forces you to stand still. If you're trying to move left or right and an enemy attacks, you're no longer moving, you're dodging. If you're moving backwards when an enemy attacks, you automatically block. You may recall that this is supposed to be a horror game, so it's a big problem that you have no reason to be scared of getting close to these enemies. In fact, you want to get close to them so that you can take them out without using ammo. So the game has this incredibly simplistic and repetitive close combat system, but you're actively encouraged to exploit it in the name of conserving ammo, which only adds to the tedium and repetition. I've said it before and I'll say it again, when a game rewards its players for using boring strategies, they are going to use boring strategies and have a boring time. Blasting the limbs off of monsters with a shotgun is obviously more interesting than doing this two-step with them over and over again, but no sensible player will waste the ammo when they have the option of taking them down without using valuable resources. There was just one enemy type in the game that felt tense to fight and had me wasting ammo in a panic, and that was the wall-crawling spider guys who can turn invisible. I don't know why they can turn invisible, but whatever. They're unpredictable because they're the only enemy type that isn't constantly running straight towards you, so I could never be quite sure where they were, and being stuck in an arena with one or more of them usually had me feeling paranoid and, dare I say it, just a little bit scared. So there is a horror game hidden here somewhere after all. For an example of a distinctly unscary part of the game, look no further than the stealth sections in the second half, after these blind enemies are introduced. There's no way around it, this part of the game is excruciatingly boring. Stealth is absurdly overpowered against these blind boys. One room sees you sneaking through a cavern with what feels like dozens of them, and it takes no effort, and crucially, no resources, to step behind them one by one and press A for an instant kill. What it does require from the player is patience. That is to say, it's a massive waste of your time. These enemies are apparently deaf as well as blind, because you can perform takedowns one after the other without attracting any attention, even on a group that's close together. In the end, I'm grateful for that, because it meant I was able to get through it on my first try and didn't have to do it more than once. I truly don't understand why this section is here, because it adds absolutely nothing to the experience, and resource management becomes completely irrelevant as you have no reason to fire any weapons. Maybe they could have fixed this part by making it so that stealth kills cost you some kind of resource, but honestly I think they would have been better off just removing it entirely. Another half-formed mechanic that appears in the second half is the tentacles that sprout from the chests of some enemies. This can happen when an enemy is near death, and you need to quickly shoot this weak spot before they mutate into a much stronger foe. Some enemies will appear with the tentacles already present, so you need to quickly one-shot them before they turn. If enemies are allowed to mutate, they get their health back and deal more damage, but they can still be beaten using the exact same strategy that you use for every other enemy in the game, so ultimately it doesn't add much to the experience. I also have to say that this whole tentacle thing is not exactly intuitive, and it's a far cry from the easy to grasp dismemberment mechanic of Dead Space, which, in case you need a reminder, was 15 years ago. I'm trying to avoid making too many direct comparisons to Dead Space, so that Callisto has a chance to stand on its own, but I can't help myself here. Dead Space experimented with its dismemberment mechanics in tons of interesting ways. There were enemies with weak spots you wanted to hit, enemies with bellies full of swarms that you didn't want to hit, enemies whose behavior changed when they lost a limb, enemies with sharp or explosive limbs that could be cut off and thrown at other enemies. I mean, holy shit, that's a lot of variety for what is at heart a fairly simple concept. With the exception of some bosses, none of the enemies in Dead Space were damage sponges, and most would lose a limb with a single shot, which meant that every bit of ammo fired could potentially make a big difference in combat, and by mixing up the enemy types and throwing them at you in different combinations, every encounter had the potential to be different from the last. When you compare that to Callisto, where there's no central mechanic like dismemberment to build encounters around, there isn't a lot of enemy variety, and where almost every enemy can be killed with the same method anyway, well, it doesn't look good for old Jacob. One more combat-related thing I want to complain about is the two-headed boss fight that gets reused no less than 4 times, to the point where I'm not even sure it counts as a boss anymore. To take him down, you have to stagger him with gunfire and then hit him with a standard melee combo. And when I say you have to, I mean you have to do exactly that, or he'll just get back up and need to be staggered again. The only way to move to the next phase is to knock off one of his heads with this pre-scripted combo. If you stagger him and try hitting him with a heavy melee attack instead, nothing happens and he just gets back up. I don't care about this takedown being pre-scripted, but the fact that the devs didn't account for a player trying to do a heavy attack on a stunned enemy is maddening to me. I have no idea if this is a glitch or just an oversight, but it's yet another thing that makes Callisto feel cheap and unfinished. The act of staggering the boss isn't particularly interesting either, and just consists of baiting him around an obstacle in the environment and pouring ammo into him until he takes a knee. Thanks to the automatic dodge, it's very difficult to mess this up, and I think I only died once to this boss despite fighting it 4 times over my playthrough. A quick note while I'm here on the visual design of the enemies, because sadly I wasn't really inspired or intrigued by any of them. You spend most of the game not actually knowing what they are or why there are mutants trying to kill you, but they're so bland and generic that I wasn't curious to find out in the slightest. The crawling, exploding guy is hardly an inspired enemy, but it is a nice touch that gore drips from the ceiling after killing one. I'm pretty sure this first encounter with one was designed specifically so that you would notice this effect, and in fairness it did make me stop and appreciate it for a minute. But anyway, I mentioned back in the intro that I saw potential in Callisto's combat system, and I've done nothing but complain about it so far, so let's get into what that potential is, because it desperately needs more added to it to bring out its strengths. It's obvious enough that the devs were going for a cinematic feel, but there are a number of problems that get in the way of that ambition. Firstly, because the enemies have so much health and can take such a beating before going down, it really makes your weapons feel puny and ineffective. You can get an upgrade later that means they lose an arm if they try to block your melee attacks, but even this feels lacking in impact. With a single arm, enemies can still do 2 attacks in a row, so what's the point of this? That leads me to the second problem getting in the way of the combat's cinematic pretensions. Seeing the same animations over and over and over again robs them of their weight and reminds you that you're playing a game. If they were going for a cinematic feel, the devs really should have focused on including as many context-sensitive kill animations as possible. The goal here should be to make every single encounter feel unique in its own way. The same goes for Jacob's death animations too, because when you're seeing the same death sequence again and again, it loses shock value very quickly. The fact that the devs gave you the option to hold A to skip most of them speaks volumes. In fairness, Callisto does take some steps towards making encounters more unique, with the traps that feature in several combat arenas, and sure enough they make for some of the more interesting combat challenges in the game. Blowing up an enemy with a well-placed shot on an explosive canister, or using your gravity glove to toss them over a railing or onto a wall of spikes or a meat grinder is always an instant kill, but because these traps almost always appear in the presence of several enemies at once, there's usually some satisfying strategy involved in using them efficiently. Unfortunately, these enjoyable instant kills only serve to further highlight the drawn-out dullness of fighting enemies the conventional way, but whenever they are available, the key to their success is that the player needs to act with intention and forethought in order to make use of them. And that's the pivotal thing here. Looking cinematic is all well and good, but a game needs to let the player act with intention for it to be any better than just watching a film. For that reason, I think Callisto really should have had a dodge button rather than an automatic dodge, maybe with different kinds of dodges needed for different enemy attacks. On top of that, I think enemies should have had way less health, but appeared in greater numbers, and to balance that out, melee attacks should eat into some kind of resource, like battery power or something. The effect of all this would hopefully be to make combat more strategic, as the player would constantly have to decide which resource to use on dispatching each enemy, and how to most efficiently clear each room, making use of traps for instant kills wherever possible. As it is now, the same method worked for me in almost every enemy encounter in the game, and it quickly became routine. I would fire a round at their legs to make them stumble, then follow it up with a melee combo to deal as much damage as possible while using as little ammo as possible. You may have noticed that most of my praise and my suggestions for Callisto's combat revolves around leaning into the resource management side of the game, so that seems a good topic to move on to next. You start off with a very limited inventory of 6 slots that can be used to carry health injectors, battery packs for the gravity glove, valuable electronics that can be sold for currency, and multiple types of ammo, only the last of which can be stacked. Around halfway into the game, your inventory size is doubled to 12, which is handy because that's roughly when you start getting more weapons with different ammo types that take up more slots. Some of the items you can carry are worth far more than others, so if you come across something good but have a full inventory, then you'll probably have to make a decision about what to use or drop to make space. If you're playing efficiently, then you're hopefully not using a lot of healing items or ammo, which means you'll want to prioritize carrying the items that can be sold for the highest amount at the Reforge machines, where you can use currency to print new weapons and upgrades, or extra healing and ammo if you're in a pinch. There's not enough money available in a single playthrough to get every upgrade, but you should be able to at least get the lower tier ones for each weapon and the final upgrade for 1 or 2. The upgrades for guns are mostly stuff like increasing damage or magazine size, but the final upgrade for some unlocks a powerful alternate fire mode that uses more ammo, which again means that you probably won't be using it outside of the final boss. Your gravity glove and melee weapon can be upgraded too, with the melee damage upgrades being the obvious ones to prioritize considering how often you use melee in this game. A few weapons can be upgraded with a foregrip to increase stability and reduce recoil, but while this appears on the gun's model, Jacob doesn't actually use it and keeps both hands on the standard grip at the back. I know it's a nitpick, but come on guys, how did you miss this? Hopefully you see what I mean by now when I say this sort of thing makes Callisto feel cheap. When it comes to carrying your guns, you can lug all 5 of them around at once, which I think was a bit of a misstep. There would have been far more strategy to the shooting if you had to choose ahead of time which ones to equip, or maybe better yet if there were separate exclusive upgrade paths that the player had to choose between. As it is now, swapping between your 5 weapons is clumsy at best. Pressing left on the D-pad will swap between your last equipped sidearm and longarm, but if you want to switch to a different sidearm or longarm, then you have to press right and then cycle to it and press A. Under the pressure of combat, this is a hopelessly long-winded method of selecting a weapon, and while you could try and argue that it's intentional, it usually feels more frustrating than fitting, and I have a suspicion that this cumbersome bit of UI design is another part of the game left unfinished. If there was just one sidearm and one longarm that the player had customized and upgraded to their own preference by choosing how to spend their resources, a lot of fat could have been trimmed here. One final point on resources. Every time you kill an enemy, you can stomp on their corpse to get something as a reward, and I can't help but feel that this is really out of place. From a purely mechanical perspective, I think it could have been more interesting if fighting enemies was something that consumed resources rather than rewarding you with more, since it would have made engaging enemies into a more stressful experience. More than that though, this overly gamey and artificial reward mechanism is just another way that the Uncanny Valley rears its not quite ugly head and stomps on any chance you had of being immersed or taking the game's world seriously. Whether it's subconscious or not, on some level every player will know that this makes no realistic sense, and it's just an unnatural contrivance to reward the player for killing monsters, which clashes with the game's otherwise lifelike presentation. I'll summarise my thoughts on this Uncanny Valley problem at the end of this video, because I think it's one of my biggest takeaways from the Callisto Protocol. So that about does it for combat and resource mechanics. The only other major topic left to cover is the game's story, but before I get into that, I have a few stray thoughts on some parts of the experience. There aren't a lot of memorable set pieces in Callisto, but the slip and slide through the tunnels and the fall down from the launch pad come to mind as exciting capstones. Or at least, they should have been exciting capstones, but the thing is, and I'm sorry to do this again, they're just miles behind the kind of thing Dead Space was experimenting with 2 generations ago. Often when Dead Space did a big set piece like this, where you were placed on rails and forced through a fast-paced gauntlet, you still had control of your weapon, and had to shoot at obstacles or enemies or a boss to avoid dying. In Callisto, You just have to slide left and right like you're playing Super Mario 64. They had the chance here to build on what came before, but instead they took a step backwards, and I don't understand how this could have happened. Why not have some obstacles or enemies that need to be moved with the gravity glove, or explosives that need to be thrown to open a path ahead? All of the ingredients are there to make something interesting out of this, but they're left on the table and all we're given is a stale piece of bread. Also, it may be another nitpick, but it does seem a little implausible that Jacob could freefall for so long and then just grab onto a pole and survive. Maybe the gravity is lower on Callisto? While I'm on the subject of completely squandered potential that Dead Space already did better, the QTE jump scares that happen occasionally throughout Callisto are maddeningly boring. A head jumps out and grabs you, and you mash Y until Jacob frees himself. It plays out exactly the same way every single time. Why? I know I already said that I don't understand how the boring slip and slide parts made it into the game, but when it comes to these QTEs, I really don't know what the fuck the devs were thinking. There's no way they can be satisfied with these encounters. Just off the top of my head, there are so many things they could have done to spice them up and make them more interesting. Instead of a QTE, what if you still had control of your gun and had to find a way to take out the head before it dragged you over to it, maybe by shooting some nearby explosive canisters? What if the head appeared from around a corner and you had to use your gun to keep regular enemies off you until you were pulled around the corner and got line of sight? Again, I have to point out that Dead Space did this better 15 years ago. There are so many things that Callisto could have played with here, and what they settled on was making you mash Y until you win. This is probably the most infuriating feature of the game for me, because it could have been such an easy win over Dead Space. And it could have been pretty damn cinematic too, if I don't say so myself. Alright, it's time for a few words on the story of the Callisto Protocol, which shouldn't take too long because there's nothing really interesting about it, and doesn't that just sum up the whole game? The first half is pretty much just Jacob trying to escape the prison with Elias, the inmate who gave him that shiv right at the beginning. When they make it out to the freezing blizzard on the surface, Elias dies, but it's no big deal because he wasn't much of a character anyway. The supposed terrorist leader Danny becomes the new sidekick instead, but their escape from the moon is halted by the big bad administrator of the prison, Warden Cole, whose ultimate motivations are unknown to us as of yet. With no way to leave Callisto, Jacob has no choice but to go along with Danny and confront Warden Cole, following a path which takes them through the old colony of Arcus that I praised earlier. Once you're out of there, the origin of the mutant things you've been fighting the whole game is finally revealed. It turns out that a gigantic alien life form was discovered underneath Callisto, and the biophage virus dormant inside it infected the original colonists in Arcus. Seeing the potential in this alien life form, the United Jupiter Company founded Black Iron Prison so that they could experiment on the biophage using the prisoners as test subjects. In a not-so-surprising twist, the medical supplies that Jacob was transporting were actually biophage samples all along, meaning that he played an unwitting part in the earlier outbreak on another Jovian moon, Europa. Side note, but I would have liked a bit of time to explore the room with the giant alien in it myself to examine it more closely. Instead, a cutscene begins the second you enter the room, and it leads straight into a boss fight that doesn't give you any time to take in your surroundings. There's only about an hour or two of game left after this point, so as you can see the story is very much piled into the back half of the game, which means that it's a little difficult to make sense of the motivations of characters at the beginning. Danny in particular remains something of a mystery throughout, since, as I said, I don't think it's fully explained what her so-called terrorist organization wants or does. So after the boss fight in the alien room, Danny gets infected and the gist is that Jacob needs to kill the final boss to get the serum that will save her. That final boss is the guard captain who put Jacob in prison at the beginning, and has appeared at a few points throughout the game in various states of mutation. Warden Cole is revealed to be a member of a secret society trying to control the evolutionary future of humanity in order to better prepare them for life among the stars, which is a somewhat believable motivation for a villain but not particularly original. The fact that his most powerful specimen is killed in battle by an ordinary human with a gun doesn't seem to deter Cole from this objective, and as his parting gift he sets the entire prison to self-destruct, causing a mad sprint to the escape pods. Classic stuff. But oh no, there's only room for one, and Jacob, apparently racked with guilt over his own oblivious role in the spread of the biophage, sacrifices himself so that Danny can escape and tell humanity what Cole and his co-conspirators are up to. As Danny is shuttled away, she monologues about Jacob's heroic sacrifice and speculates on his motives, and any self-respecting story would have ended there. But this story has some DLC it wants to sell you, so we cut back to Jacob and find out there is another way out after all, with one last jump scare just to really drive that middle finger home. As you can probably tell, I don't think too highly of Callisto's story, and this panhandling cliffhanger was the final nail in the coffin for me. It's quite fitting that the game ends literally unfinished, since so many other parts of the experience feel that way too, but there's a particular kind of anti-consumer poison to this deliberate holding back of story resolution so that it can be sold separately later. I can forgive the graphical glitches and UI shortcomings as necessary evils because I tend to assume that developers are usually unhappy with them as well, but just didn't have the time or resources to solve them. In this case, however, the devs have a clear financial incentive to leave the game unfinished so that they can sell the ending as DLC, and that winds me up to no end. The Callisto Protocol is not a low-cost, play once and move on indie game, or at least it's not priced like one. It's been marketed as a full-price AAA blockbuster title, and the fact that the devs resorted to pulling the rug like this is honestly shameful. Once again, I'm drawn to question what exactly the devs spent their budget on, because the parts of the game that I assume were the most expensive, the graphics and the Hollywood mocap, were absolutely, unequivocally not worth the price. The fact that that price is now being passed on to the consumer in the form of this ending DLC is truly despicable. When does a game look too good for its own good? Graphically speaking, we seem to be reaching a point where games really might soon be close to looking like real life. But the closer to that threshold we get, the harder it will be for players to overlook the conventional mechanics and contrivances of games. If it looks real but doesn't feel real, all of that effort has been wasted, and your game will fall into the Uncanny Valley trap that I've mentioned throughout this video. When I caught a glimpse of trailers for the Callisto Protocol before release, the photorealism of the grisly death scenes they showed off gave me a funny feeling in my stomach, as if I was watching a real snuff film. I expected that feeling to persist into the game itself when I started playing, so part of me was genuinely scared to start a playthrough. It turned out that I needn't have worried, because right from the beginning of that playthrough, the artificiality of it all is impossible to ignore and prevents any real immersion into the experience. In this way, the Callisto Protocol pulled off the dubious feat of being a horror game that scared me more before I started playing. The environments may look realistic, but their layout shows the obvious influence of a designer's hand, and they feel more like a theme park than a real place. Even if the enemies looked threatening, which I don't think they do, you can literally dodge their attacks by accident when trying to move around them. On top of that, every single one is hiding health pickups, currency and ammo inside their bodies, just waiting for you to stomp them out, so it's a little hard to take them seriously. The faces and mocap may look real, but it's impossible to think of these characters as real people when they seem to be living in a cartoon, and in Jacob's case, when you've seen him die in exactly the same way dozens of times. It's possible that with enough time and resources, all the problems I just mentioned could be overcome, and the Uncanny Valley conquered, but then you'd surely be looking at years of extra development time, not to mention the way the budget would balloon if you attempted that. And that's just not how game development works. A dev team will always need to make trade-offs and prioritize certain parts over others in order to get a game out on time, especially in the AAA space. But graphical fidelity, like so many things, is a field of diminishing returns, and after a certain point, pouring more money at it and putting in actual, real-life people's faces will only detract from the other parts of your game that desperately need some attention. The Callisto Protocol has set a precedent for itself that means that any future sequel will need to, at the very least, match the graphical qualities of this first game. And until technology catches up to the point where the devs have enough resources to focus on bridging the gap in quality between the graphics and the other areas of their game's design, the Uncanny Valley will be where this series stays. That is when a game looks too good for its own good.